Welcome to the School of Rock Bottom with Oliver Mason. I'm an actor, a voiceover artist, a performing arts school principal, and a mental health coach. And it's these careers and passions combined that are giving birth to this podcast. Those working in performing arts and entertainment are up to 15 times more likely to suffer with anxiety and twice as likely to suffer from depression. And those working across the creative industries are 3 times more likely to have a mental health problem. Now, as you know, on this podcast, I invite really amazing creatives that have lived through a rock bottom but have survived. And they share what they learnt, how they got out, and how they continue to live in the light. And I'm delighted today because I have got the delightful David Sayers. How you doing, David?
I'm good, thank you.
That's
good.
Brilliant. Now, this is episode 10, right? And I hope you've been keeping count. This is episode 10, so I'm doing a little bit of a special. It's also Mental Health Awareness Week. The day this goes out, it won't be, but we are currently recording in that week. And so I'm doing a bit of a special, and I wanted to have a different lens today. So David doesn't work in a creative industry, although I'm sure you are very creative. He actually works in the world of business and is a managing director. And I think it's really important to have other voices, other lenses on this show. And what I'm going to do before we dive straight in, David, if that's all right, I'm just going to give you a little bio so people know exactly who David is. So David Sayers is the managing director of Compass Executives and a board member of Compass Recruitment Solutions, an award-winning recruitment solutions business focused on companies and investors across the health, care, education and life sciences markets in the UK and internationally. CRS are winners of Health Investors Recruiter of the Year Award 2021, 2019, 2017. And in 2022, executive search specialist brand Compass Executives was awarded Health Investors Inaugural Search Firm of the Year Award. Now, David has been in recruitment industry for almost 3 decades now, having started his career in finance. David is a campaigner for diversity and inclusion and is passionate about awareness of mental health and well-being in the workplace. And until recently, David was the vice chair of Mind Croydon, and David lives in South London and is married with 2 children. How was that?
That's perfect. It's almost like you wrote it for me.
Kind of, with a bit of help. A little bit of a trigger warning just before we dive in. Today we are discussing depression, and there may be references to suicide, obviously with our aim to increase suicide prevention. Please do not self-diagnose your depression. And if you are concerned, please go and speak to a medical professional. A couple of stats before I get to my first question around depression, because it's going to be the overriding theme, I think, today. And these actually quite surprised me, David, although I shouldn't have been surprised. 5% globally have depression. Depression has become a leading cause of disability. By 2030, the World Health Organization predicts that the disorder could be the main contributor to the global burden of disease. And in the UK, in March 2020, 10% of the population were estimated to be suffering with depression. And during the pandemic, it actually went up to 21%, and now it's dipped back down to 16, which is very high, or 1 in 6. We should mention as well that the vast majority of people who have depression do not attempt or die by suicide, but depression is linked to a greater risk of suicide. And researchers estimate that about 60% of people that lose their lives to suicide have a mood disorder such as depression or bipolar disorder. And 1 in 15 people attempt suicide. And the rate of male suicide is alarmingly high, with 3 out of 4 suicides in the UK by men, which really surprised me it would be that high, particularly in men. I hope you don't mind, David. I'm just going to get straight to it.
Yeah, can I just pick up on a couple of those things there? There's quite interesting stats in there. Working in the mental health industry for Mind and ultimately talking at a few events, there's a few interesting kind of bylines to those stats. 5% globally, and it surprisingly feels quite low. I think the stat that was banded around a while ago, and this is pre-COVID, but they talked about 1 in 3 individuals will have some form of correlation or connection to depression or anxiety, whether that be themselves or family members. I'm not surprised in the slightest that the pandemic got it to a peak of over 26%. I think that was the number you used. I generally think that those numbers are probably soft on the basis that people don't typically go and talk to their doctor. So that's probably based on diagnosis, I suspect.
Absolutely.
worryingly, I think those numbers are probably light.
Thank you for that insight, David. That really helps frame that. So the first question I always ask, arguably the hardest question of the entire podcast, I've asked you on, David, because obviously you've had a rock bottom in your life, but you have a very successful career and you continue to do so. I wondered if you could use all your storytelling skills to take the listeners and viewers back to that rock bottom moment, try and take us to where you were, what was happening, and really try to take us back to that time.
Yeah, sure. It's 12 years ago now, but on certain days and certain times, depending on how I feel at that particular time, it's almost like last week. I think the reality of it is the rock bottom, bluntly, had me in a mental health facility, albeit a private one. My friends joked that I was the only person they knew that could go to a private health facility with a swimming pool and a tennis court, but nevertheless, it was a place that I didn't really want to be. There's a lot of culminating factors that got me there, but the reality is 12 years ago, I was in a room with a gentleman outside who'd gone through my wash bag to make sure there was nothing in my bag that I could harm myself with, and stood outside my room for the first 3 days, and woke me up every hour on the hour. There's funny things that spring to mind, really. One of the things that there was no curtains on the room, of course, for obvious reasons, but it kept me awake, not so much as the guy waking me up. I couldn't sleep. I didn't want to be there. I didn't feel that my condition warranted me being there, but nevertheless, I had to be there for my safety of myself and probably my family around me at the time. Because, I had suicidal thoughts and I tried to take my life.
Right, I see.
But 12 years ago, undoubtedly, and we talked a little bit before we came on air, if it wasn't for that, I wouldn't be sitting here now, unequivocally. And we'll get into some of the detail around support mechanisms and everything else. But, it was a long, slippery road there. And one of the things I've learned subsequent to that moment is that there's opportunities, if you are self-aware, and we'll talk about that later, where you can arrest the slide.
Most definitely. Thank you for being so generous with sharing that, David. I just wanted to, because we are, I think, primarily talking about depression, and like you say, there was a suicide attempt, and before we kind of get into the detail of that a little bit more, is there any links to your childhood or genetics that you think might have played a role in getting you to that moment that you just described?
Yeah, I mean, psychology 101, isn't it? We're all, we're a byproduct. What's the expression? They fuck you up, your mum and dad. I think there's a certain sentimentality to that. But it's too trite, I think, to say that, my upbringing, my childhood. But of course, there are factors in there that resonate. I think with the benefit of a diagnosis, and we'll come back to that because that's fairly critical, and also with the benefit of having quite a bit of conversations with my various therapists through the years, is I've been able to really kind of understand some pivot points and some changes. My diagnosis really is I had a manic episode. I'm not bipolar. I'm not a manic depressive. I had a depressive episode, and such that's a sort of a broader diagnostic term. But what I would say is that, once I started to analyse what led me to that position, it's helped me really manage my illness going forward. And I think it is an illness. I think it's something you have to recognise. It's difficult to describe. If you fell down the stairs and broke your ankle, it's pretty obvious what's wrong with you. Some of the challenges around the definition of illness, the definition of what it is and how you describe it is also part of the enigma and also part of the problem. Slightly off topic. For sure. I had a great childhood in many respects. My father's no longer with me. I didn't have the best of relationships with my father on occasions, but he was a product of his time. And I think that my father undoubtedly had some mental health episodes of his own, but it was not, a few decades ago. If you think we're struggling to make progress now, trust me, 50 years ago was considerably different. And I'm fairly sure that there was a contributor. So to answer your question, there probably is a connective tissue around mental health or mental well-being. If your parents have suffered or people around you have suffered, you're either probably more acutely aware of it, or potentially, you might have the gene. I don't think there's any, I'm sure the scientists are screaming blue murder now listening to this. There isn't genetics, but environment plays a huge factor.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and apparently there are genetics involved that they're discovering recently, without sort of getting into too much science now.
Yeah.
One specifically that transports serotonin, that they believe there could be a hereditary factor there. But I think I'll be key to stress that isn't a depression gene per se, no. But it makes arguably you more susceptible to depression. If you don't mind, I'd just like to go through some of the kind of classic symptoms of depression, and then kind of ask you if any of these applied to you.
Yep.
Or if any of these are things that you still continue to look out for. So the first one is probably very obvious. The first one is a lot of sadness. Well, I guess that one goes without saying. Specifically this one, it says that if you're crying more often, that can be a sign of depression. Was that something that was happening to you in that period 12 years ago?
I cry at anything. I mean, I my children rib me terribly that I'm a sucker for a Disney movie, and I'll burst into tears at the slightest emotional sentiment. So probably I'm prone to it. I can't really, in all honesty, and I'm going to be very honest with all of this, I can't remember myself crying more. I definitely remember being on the verge of tears and out of control more. Whether that's one and the same thing, I'd probably agree with that. I don't think I was crying more per se, but I was certainly at a point where I just felt incredible depths of sadness for prolonged periods of time. Yeah, for sure.
Because I think it's important to talk about these things, because the stereotype, particularly in the past around depression, was you're just going through a bit of a bad patch, and it's not that. This is a serious mental health condition, and some of these markers I think are quite interesting to go through. The other one is anhedonia, or, that's a posh way of saying unable to feel pleasure, I suppose.
Yeah.
Is that something that was going on at the time?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, there are tiny things in my life that give me, a number of different things that give me great pleasure. A decent glass of wine, a good book, a nice walk in the country, being with friends and family, sporting events, you name it, a whole bunch of things. Definitely a symptom is that I retracted from all of social environments. Nothing gave me pleasure at all. Food tasted fairly anodyne. I didn't really, thankfully I chose that, alcohol did nothing for me at that particular time, so I stopped drinking. And generally, it was probably much later on that I'd realised that all of these things that gave me pleasure were no longer in my list of things to do. So yeah, completely without pleasure, nothing gave me pleasure, and even things that you would look forward to, you'd arrive at and actually derive no sense of pleasure from them whatsoever.
And were you aware of it at the time, or were you sort of in a period where you were unable to make those connections?
Unequivocally, you're aware of it. The frustration, sense of frustration, is you can't break the cycle. And yeah, it's a slippery slope. I talk a lot, and I've talked a lot about this in the past. I'll do some shout outs further down the line, but I was talking at an event a while back where I talked about mental health being on a bit of a continuum. So if you can imagine, 10 being you're at your worst, and 0 being you're at your best, or either way, vice versa. And all of us have mental health. This is the thing. All of us are on a journey. And I view that, everybody environmentally will have a period of stress and anxiety in their life. There's nothing new about that. The difference is when you don't reset. That's the pivotal part for me. So, if you've had a bad time with a partner, or you've got financial worries, these things can be episodal, and you'll reset.
Yeah.
If you just realise that you're on that slope and things are progressively getting worse, then there is an issue here. I think everybody, and it's one of the problems around the word depression, is that people use it sometimes too liberally. I feel a bit depressed today. On Monday, I'm a bit depressed. Maybe not the right term. They're probably, they're just feeling a little bit low, given a series of characteristics. They had a bad weekend. They've got money worries. They've got a report in on Monday. That they're stressing about. They're at uni and they're behind on the exam cycle. All of these are environmental factors that will give you those symptoms. But on the main, to most people, they're temporary.
Yeah.
So to the point you make, absolutely, I was aware that these things were building, and absolutely, I was acutely aware that there was nothing I could say or do that would kick me out of it.
And I sorry to interrupt you.
Not at all.
I would imagine as well that would add to the frustration, because you're almost describing a kind of inner voice, which sounds like it's you almost saying, pull yourself together.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't want to put words into your mouth. And then you sort of having an internal battle. Why can't I get myself? Why can't I enjoy the rugby? Why can't I enjoy this glass of wine or this meal?
Yeah. I mean, it's almost, and then I'm really keen that we use this as the springboard to go on to talk about how people can recognize the symptoms, how they can ask for help, how they can, to some extent control these processes a lot, but with a greater level of awareness. I just naturally, I knew I was in a bad place. And the reality is I'd been in a bad place for quite a long time, and there was peaks and troughs through it. I'll give you a classic example. One of the diagnoses is that I have a condition, if you will, called codependency. Right. So for those people who don't know what it is, it's very simple that adversely you view relationships based as a complete mirror back to you. Right. So to give you an example, I could be in a room full of people and have a really nice time and really had a good evening, and I'll, want to go to say goodbye to somebody, and you didn't quite say goodbye with the kind of love and affection I thought they would, given the nice time I had, and then you'd go away and you'd focus on that moment rather than 90% of the evening. Yeah, I can relate. Clearly massively unhealthy. You'd be paranoid about the condition of the status of your friendship group and your family or your workers or your colleagues or your boss specifically. And you really chronically overread situations. You really interpreted things quite differently. Yeah. And that was just something that just eroded you over time. And actually, that's one of the areas which I've really worked really hard on. And still to this day, there's still some overriding symptoms to that. Sure. But, go back to your earlier point, the frustration you couldn't reset. But the frustration didn't know who to talk to. And that's a big point. Who do I talk to about this? Because there is, I'm still old enough of that generation where I'm pretty sure I remember speaking to my mother and father who were, wonderfully supportive and loving. Don't get me wrong, but you go, oh God, Mum, I'm a bit depressed. And you go, what have you got to be depressed about? Yeah, absolutely. So there was a kind of, the stigma still persists, and we'll talk about that later on as well. But ultimately, it was difficult to know what help you needed, or even if you needed any help at all. And I would imagine as well in the role, I don't know what role you had at work in that period 12 years ago, but I know I get this a lot with performers that come on. They always feel that they've got to be switched on. Yeah. They've always got to be on. We've just had a lovely conversation before going on air, and you're incredibly sociable and incredibly likable. And I would imagine that the role that you've got within business, that there's a pressure to always sort of be on and, not show that side. Would that be true in your line of work as well? Yeah, 100%. 100%. I mean, at the end of the day, we're a recruitment business, and you can't unpick the fact that there's a fairly significant sales element to that. So, you've got a big pitch, you're performing, you've got an hour. And in COVID, that meant staring down the lens of a camera. It's now starting to I get into rooms with people again now. But, that those situations can be very tense. Yeah. It's the difference between, making your budget, not making your budget. You've got an hour to convince somebody they should use you versus somebody else. So, there's performance in that for sure. I mean, it's based, clearly, I'm bound to say this, with a lot of substance and a lot of background information and expertise. But ultimately, you're convincing somebody that you're better than the other person they've just seen. Yeah, and that would have, I'm sure, added to this feeling that you can't talk to someone that you described back then. And I think depression and work is something that we'll definitely come back to, because that's obviously a big topic. Yeah. The next sort of classic symptom, you kind of just dealt with it in a way, is guilt and this feeling of low self-esteem. The guilt being, why can't I get myself out of it? Did it also erode your self-esteem at the time and how you viewed yourself? My darker moments. I think that, that we talked earlier on off camera, didn't we? I talked about the kind of Mr. Saturday Night function where, you kind of, your friends know you as one particular individual, and therefore you play up to the stereotype of that. And I think if I'm really honest with myself, there have been times in the past where, I've probably over-exaggerated who I am and what I can do, because you didn't want people to see the reality. That's a double bite, because when you get back home, you go, God, why did I say that? Why did I talk about that? Jeepers. If that comes out and they find out that's not really true, then I'm even in a worse position than I was if I was just honest. I mean, I think that was that was a self-esteem issue for sure, because I didn't think people would like the real me. And I think one of the things I'm most comfortable with now is the fact that I'm genuine.
Yeah.
And I think there was a period of time, certainly preceding that I probably wasn't.
Yeah. It's amazing how that theme has run through all the podcasts so far, that, going through any kind of period where you can't be your authentic self can really erode your mental health, you know. Self-harm, suicidal thoughts. You've already shared that, that's something that that is part of your journey as well.
Yeah, really important to emphasize this though. This was a long way in, right? You talked about the suicide stats, which are horrendous. Okay, but some context is useful in these things. Is that you go a long way down the path before you start thinking of that as an option.
Yeah,
and let me tell you, the frightening thing about it is that and again, there are professionals in the industry that might doubt this. So these are my personal views, and I'm happy for people to challenge this offline later. But, on the main, most people that say they're going to kill themselves often don't. It's a cry for help.
Yeah.
More often than not, that people that have an intention to do it just go off and do it. That's the regrettable thing. And if only you could have got to them sooner and only have an indication. And most of the tragic stories you read about some of the teenage people that have taken their lives is their parents had no inclination that that's what they were thinking of.
Yeah.
So it was much further down in my journey that, having burnt through relationships, having burnt through work relationships, having gone to a period of real darkness, that actually genuinely, and most people say this, I thought it was the only option. And really worryingly to me now, because it seems quite perverse to say it was the logical thing to do. The world will be better off without me in it, and my pain would go away instantaneously. You have to be in an unbelievably dark place, right, for that to start to formate. So if anybody's watching this and they're worried that stress and anxiety ultimately leads to that, it doesn't. Right, it's a very small percentage. Unfortunately, the percentage is high because the population is high. So stats, damn lies, and statistics, right? So I want to just put that out there. And you were quite right to talk about triggers at the start.
Yeah.
I also want to put a bit of context into it. That there's a long journey that one goes through before you get here. And what we know, and we'll talk about this later, early intervention prevents an awful lot of that happening. But it's how, when, and who, and that's we'll get into that as well.
And that's why these conversations are so important, because not only does it break stigma and it shows people that have very successful lives can get through it. We're also going to be talking about obviously the preventative measures that you can put in place so it doesn't get there. You've touched on this as well, but I just want to probe you a little bit more. This is quite an interesting stat, that 1/3 of people that suffer with major depression have a substance misuse problem. Now, I know you don't. You said something quite interesting that I've not heard on this podcast yet, which was alcohol did nothing for me, which I'm really delighted to hear, because when you self-medicate with drugs and alcohol, it never ends well. Is that something that just never crossed your mind?
Alcohol for me is a social thing. I drink when I'm happy. I'm surrounded by alcohol. If you come to my house, I'm surrounded by alcohol.
Yeah,
but we rarely drink at home unless people are around, or it's a Friday or Saturday night. The concept of opening wine on a Tuesday night probably doesn't happen that often.
Yeah.
Alcohol is something I do when I'm happy.
Yeah.
It's something I do with a group of friends. And don't get me wrong, there are times when I've probably drunk a few too beers too many. But yeah, bizarrely, luckily, and I'll sort of come back to this in a second, but luckily, alcohol or drug misuse or whatever it wasn't part of the plan. What was interesting and backs up the point, the clinic I was in was also a clinic for people that had drug and alcohol misuse in there as well. And when I eventually got into the group sessions, despite me screaming and kicking that I didn't want to be one of the group sessions, I realized that probably I was in the minority in terms of people who actually turned to drink or drugs as some form of self-medication. So thankfully, that's not something that I had to deal with.
Fantastic. Well, I'm delighted to hear that. That's wonderful. Another symptom is negative delusional thinking, sometimes professionally called confabulation, which is a kind of a delusional thinking, basically, that it's an anti-self belief system that can set in with depression.
Yeah.
So the dialogue always is, even if you've got evidence that actually things are getting better, well, it's not getting better. And it's not just negative thinking. The symptom is actually believing it to be true, almost making up stories in the head. Is that something that was going on at the time, or not really?
Yeah, I probably wouldn't describe it that way, but yeah, I've got some stories and issues probably where I think that probably would hold true. I think certainly from a career aspect rather than a personal aspect, from a career aspect, there were certainly times I left organisations prematurely because actually I just felt the walls were closing in.
Right.
And despite the fact that they were telling me things were great, it didn't feel great to me, and the best solution was to step away. Part of that was my guilty secret. We'll talk about this later on as well, but I'm building up quite a to-do list of things to talk about later on. I'll just work this out.
That's okay.
I remember being at an event and hearing people for the first time talk about their mental health journeys, and up until that point, it had always been my guilty secret. The stigma attached to anybody in any walk of life around admitting that they have a mental health diagnosis or a mental health issue, or they struggle with their mental health, is still real.
Absolutely.
I think it magnifies itself in your industry potentially when goodness knows if you had a casting and they were about to invest an awful lot of money on a film, and they suddenly thought that maybe you couldn't get through it for their perception, that would be a black mark. Yeah. Certainly, it's changing in business, but there's a big feeling that going to your boss and telling them about how you're struggling or you might need some help is still considered by many to be off limits.
Yeah. Wow.
So yeah, I definitely think that even though people around me are telling me things were fine, they didn't feel fine, and I was worried that the secret would come out, or I would collapse in a heap. So yeah, resigning and going taking another job with a clean sheet of paper seemed like a good option, and that was all rolled up in the same thing.
Yeah. One of the frustrating things I'm sure that you've heard around depression is, go and do some exercise, because we all know that exercise helps mental health generally. But when you're in depression, of course, you don't have the energy or the wherewithal to do that exercise. And so that brings me to my next point, which is around just utter exhaustion and fatigue. Was that something that you suffered with at the time?
Yeah, I mean, there's also a little bit as well, dare I say it, that the devil's in the back of your head, that, you feel bad, you wallow a little bit in it. I certainly did. I'm speaking for myself. I'm not speaking to the masses. I wallowed a bit in it. Go out and have a walk. It's the last thing I want to do. I want to stay here.
Yeah.
So, yeah, there is absolutely a great correlation. I mean, it might not look it, but I like to keep fit. I've got a bike at home. I like to get on my bike and like do all those things. And I like getting out in the countryside and walking and what have you. So exercise does make you feel better. Yeah, if you can, get out, do it. Fantastic. There's definite correlation to that. I think when I go back to this point that when you get past a certain point, you might know what will get you out of the funk, but you either can't be bothered, you don't want to do it, and actually in some perverse way you've got something in your brain telling you that the funk is where you need to be. You have to live with it, sit with it. I think that I used to play a lot of golf. I love golf. I still play golf now, not to the standard I used to play, but I love it nevertheless. And I was a member of a golf club with a whole bunch of folks that I'd known for 16, 17 odd years that was a mile away from my front door, but I couldn't be bothered to go and play golf.
Right.
And then it's like, well, why aren't you playing golf? And why aren't you seeing your friends? And why aren't you going to do that? And it's like, well, it's there. The data's there for you, but actually you're just going, I don't want to.
Yeah. And what role did anxiety play? Because often depression and anxiety go hand in hand, but not always. Anxiety is not really something that you've touched on yet. Has it played a role in your sort of general mental health, or have they been quite compartmentalized?
Yeah, in all honesty, I view them as one and the same animal. Really, they just existed in slightly different ways.
Yeah.
There's good anxiety, right? Yeah. Getting nervous for something that means something means you produce your best performance. I've heard every single person that's ever got up on a stage going, actually, that 5 minutes beforehand where you'd rather do anything but do what you're just about to do is probably good for your performance, and certainly true in business. Pitches, presentations, talking to your guys or whatever, a bit of nervousness keeps you on your game. So there's good anxiety. Bad anxiety is when you just, you make it as an excuse to not do stuff, or you use it as a stick to beat yourself with. The worst thing about it is when you are really struggling, it goes back to your self-esteem thing, you will find many different ways to prove to yourself that you're not worthy. You prove to yourself that, you're not a great person. You prove to yourself that, people will be better off with you not being in their company, and you just want to just remove yourself from all of those aspects. And the anxiousness is that, for me, anxiousness was, the anxiousness that this is never going to get better. So my anxiety was building on the basis that, well, this is my journey. This is what I'm used to. This is the culmination of these things. You've been thinking this for years, David. So guess what? It's now happening. So
that's the great con, I think, of bad mental health, is that it says this is permanent. You can't get out, and you just feel stuck. Like you say, it was a long time ago now, You've had a very successful career. You continue to do so. You mentioned, obviously, that rehab, that intervention that you went to. Obviously, that was a big tool and something that turned it round for you. What else has got you to this place where you've got this happy and healthy life? Rehab being one component. What were the other components that helped?
Well, that's the building blocks, really. But I think part of it is once you deal with the fact that, so I'll take you back a step. There was a lightning moment for me, and everything kind of changed from this perception. I was in the clinic for 2.5 weeks, and my counsellor was saying, I need you to come to a group session. It was like, I'm sorry, I'm not all part of that. Hi, I'm David. I'm a manic depressive. Although I wasn't, as I mentioned earlier on. I wasn't ready for that. But actually, ironically, I remember sitting in a group. The feeling of isolation is a key factor in one's depression. Because you think it's only you that feels that way. Nobody will understand it. The difficulty that, even though, I pride myself on being a bit of a wordsmith, my inability to describe to people how I felt added to the problem. Because if you didn't describe it well enough, people couldn't understand it well enough, and therefore they couldn't help you. So there was a bit where, unfortunately, alpha males typically, hey, I'm not feeling so great. What's the matter with you? Come and have a pint. It'll all be fine. Meant that often there was a bit of a barrier to kind of slightly deeper conversation. I remember the incredulousness that my friends had that I was in a clinic. What, you? Seemingly you're the type of person that could brush all that stuff off and really surprised it's happened to you. And maybe, and to some extent, it shone a bit of a light in their own lives as well, a bit of awareness. But coming back to that sort of critical lightning bolt, I sat in a group session, and then this young lad stood up and told the room about how he felt. It was so accurate to how I felt. I'm still emotional to this day because he used words that were so precise, and actually the words I would have used to describe who I was. And the lightning bolt is, Jesus, I'm no longer alone.
Absolutely.
This isn't unique to me. This isn't these things have happened to you, this is why you feel that way, this is your destiny. This is like, jeepers, there's more than one of us. And that was the breakthrough. And from there, it was a slow understanding and acceptance of who you are, an acceptance of what got you there, an acceptance of what could fix you.
Wow.
And like when you had those building blocks, and I talk about fixing you because I am, it's a work in progress. People who go to the gym are never at their perfect weight, height, or
I'm done now,
or muscularity. They never go,
I'm done.
I can drop that now.
Absolutely.
Mental health is the same. It's still part of a journey. It's why people go to learn. This is a learning mechanism, just learning about yourself, right? So, but having some building blocks, having some kind of key watch outs, like if that starts happening, that's something you should probably not ignore and focus on. So if I get an event come through and go, I can't be asked. I generally ask myself, am I saying I can't be asked because I'm busy, tired, and I've got other things to do? Or is this the start of something where I haven't had a couple of good weeks and I want to kind of remove myself a little bit? So I've wandered off theme a little bit, but I'm coming back to this now, is that it's about understanding about how you build, how you grow, and how you develop. And the learning blocks are how one learns to drive a car or how one learns to do a job. It's no different to how one learns to how to manage your own mental journey.
Absolutely.
There's a number of different factors: professional help, absolutely critical. Having some friends around you that you can talk to, having a support mechanism where you can go, do you know what, not feeling so good today.
Can I just tap into that a little bit more? Because you've really highlighted there that the power of shared experience and human beings coming together and that connection, and how that can just be a lightning bolt moment. Is that something that you still continue to have as part of your life? Have you got a space where you can talk about your mental health or your feelings with anyone else?
Yeah. My wife's incredible. The family are amazing. My son and daughter, we have a very open conversations about, their own journeys, and they ask me about mine as well. So it's a shared experience. I've been very open with my management team and the founders of my business. And I'm absolutely sure I haven't needed to do it yet, but I knew if I actually went to one of the guys and go, you know what, I'm having a bit of a tough time at the moment, we could have a proper conversation.
Yeah.
These are all critical factors for me.
Yeah.
There's a bit of bravery attached to that as well. There's a bit of a step into the unknown. We talked about this off camera, but a pivotal moment for me, and I'm very grateful to, and you know who you are, but I was grateful to a couple of people that invited me to an event. I watched a chief exec of a FTSE 20 business stand up on a stage in front of 3,000 people and talk about his mental health journey.
Wow.
It was another one of those lightning bolt moments. If this guy can do that, then why can't I? Because if I can't be honest, then this could build again.
Yeah.
And, a couple of months later, your wife was in the room actually when I did it, but I stood up in front of my work colleagues, it was about 80, 90 people strong, and told them this story.
Wow.
And it got an incredible reaction, very supportive, surprise. But it was a fundamental part of my longer term preservation, is that I'm not shy about telling people. I don't ram it down their throat, and I want to talk about the logistics of it all. And and I said to you before, I have to pinch myself. It was 12 years ago.
Yeah, absolutely.
But nevertheless, the problem is here and now. And if my focus now isn't to keep myself in a good space, but to encourage businesses to be more open about this, to encourage individuals to be, more open, go and talk to people, find somebody you can talk to. Because if you start talking early, the preventative cure around this is massive. So I'm going to give a shout out to these guys, but I was vice chair of Mind in Croydon.
Yes.
They've got this facility called Recovery Space, whereby your GP or A&E, if you present yourself, you can be referred in to see a clinician. And we talked about this, and I'm not going to get into the political NHS agenda at all, but nevertheless, there is a massive gap between needing help and getting help, unfortunately. But these guys recognize the power of early intervention and the conversation. And actually, for me, I'm not in a good space at the moment. Okay, do you want to talk about it? Yeah, let's grab a coffee with somebody you trust, or a process you trust, or an organization you trust is life-changing.
Yeah.
And we talked about this earlier on around it doesn't end that way. It's not predetermined that you end up over here. There's many different steps. Having a support mechanism, having people around me I can talk to, having people that, more often than not, it's just a chat. More often than not, I'm not feeling great about this. And actually, emotionally, being able to talk about situations in retrospect and say, I reacted this way because that's how I felt at the time, and this is what's going on in my head now. Let's talk about it, and being a bit more open and honest and learning from kind of the mistakes of the past.
Well, I know you're very, very passionate, obviously, about mental health in the workplace, and it's kind of just hit me why, maybe, and maybe it shouldn't have been, because it's probably bleeding obvious, but it's a huge preventative measure. It's not just about the fact that you're passionate about it and you want everyone to be mentally well, which is obviously a great thing. But I hadn't really thought about it until you just described it. It's a huge preventative measure, because if you've got a space in work and a culture and environment where you can talk, then that in itself can lead to prevention and hopefully, change, and it not getting to the dark place that it can go. I was going to ask you about the workplace.
Can I just?
Yeah, go for it. Yeah,
that preventative thing is the biggest ally we have in the space. I don't know what the percentages are. I'm going to move away from the stats, but I wouldn't mind betting that 70+% of people that can have some form of early intervention will not develop ongoing issues going forward.
I'm sure it is that high. Yeah, I'm sure it is.
And, I know that my previous company and the one I'm in at the moment, we've got 10 fully trained mental health first aiders. How strongly, how heavily they're utilised, I don't know. We shouldn't know because, people want to keep this. It's a personal thing.
Yeah.
But we've got a very open culture in our organisation which would encourage people to have those conversations. Yeah. And more power to it. And, there's a number of people that have organised in some fantastic events, the Mad World events, the water cooler events run by a good friend of mine, Mark Pigeau, and the rest of the guys there. That's their focus, is let's get organisations to think more creatively about well-being and support of their staff. Mm-hmm. Because, from an example here, I'm an MD of a business. We're having, we're doing very well as a business.
Yeah.
I can now say this without any form of, bragging in any shape or form. I'm good at my job. But I'm lucky to be here. But I'm good at my job now because I'm comfortable in who I am and in my space, and that's because of all the other things we just talked about.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess that school of rock bottom in a tidy bow, isn't it? It's because of those dark moments and what you've gone through. Yeah. It's actually allowed you to be your authentic self and get to this strong place and ultimately help other people. It's amazing that a rock bottom or hard times can do that. It can actually be a complete game changer. And I do think a rock bottom is kind of like the world's greatest teacher. As long as you don't stay there too long, and obviously it doesn't end in tragedy, it can be an amazing springboard, even just having this conversation today.
Well, it's brilliant what you're doing, Oliver, because, at the end of the day, there's a lot talked around, prevention and cure. There's a lot talked around the actual illness itself. And there's not an awful lot of talk about people who come out the other side and got something positive to add. There's a whole bunch of folk that are sitting in chairs just like me right here, right now, that have had the support when they needed it, and they are living incredibly fruitful lives. I'm always struck by people who take their own life as an incredible waste. What if? Right?
Yeah, absolutely. I've got... You can probably tell I like a stat. It's definitely my nerdy side coming out, ladies and gentlemen.
I'm in finance, mate. I love a stat.
This comes from the Priory Group website, some stuff around work. And these stats probably don't surprise you. Depression is responsible for 109 million lost working days every year in England at a cost of $9 billion to the economy. And for every £1 spent by employers on mental health interventions, they get £5 back in reduced absence and staff turnover, and only 10% seek help in the workplace. I mean, the cynic in me is probably thinking, well, that's maybe why some businesses are waking up, because they've realised that there's a financial cost to this.
Yeah.
But obviously for people like you, it's not that. Do those stats surprise you? I'm guessing not.
No. Don't surprise me at all. I mean, I think the other stat in there around, only 10% of people talk. So what's happened to the other 90%? If those other 90%, and if you look at the stat, I said about 1 in 3 earlier on, if 90% aren't talking, there's a 1 in 3 ratio, then you realise it's a bit more of a tsunami to those numbers probably. I know the guys at Priory very well. We actually work very closely with them. So those stats don't surprise me in the slightest. I mean, I think listen, you can be cynical, right? But I work in the recruitment industry, and we deal with placing people into organisations all of the time. And we talk about culture, and we talk about how you value your asset. Right? Assets walk out the door all the time, right? But if they walk out the door because it's something you could have fixed, well, that's on you, isn't it?
Yeah.
But I think as organisations who are thinking in the right way and genuinely care about their people, and I don't believe there are organisations out there that just don't care. They probably just haven't registered what they can do to kind of affect change. There may be some exceptions to that, but on the main, I reckon that's true. Why wouldn't you want to look after your folk? Why wouldn't you want to make that a good place to go and work? It doesn't matter whether the financial advantages are there. Isn't it just the right thing to do? I've been a diversity lead for many years, and I can tell you that when we talk about whether we should hire more women on boards or whether there should be more black people, or whatever, I still keep coming back to again. But just isn't it the right thing to do?
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, that's just come back to it. A healthy workforce is a productive workforce. That's true. That's not some glib statement. It's true. And there's many ways that employers, and it's not all around paying them more money and giving them free breakfasts. It's actually giving them an environment where they can be free to be the best version of themselves, where they're supported, when they're nurtured, and they feel they're being looked after. Isn't it? It shouldn't work be an extension of family in its broadest sense.
Yeah,
that's where I like going to work.
Yeah,
I wouldn't have said that a few years ago, I have to say.
Well, gives a job then. Sounds like I want to go work for David. Right, that's it. I quit my acting career. I'm going to work for David. It sounds great.
Anytime.
I know my listeners and viewers are going to be interested in this area, and it might not be an area that you want to touch on or talk about. We haven't talked about the role of medication in depression up until this point, and obviously neither of us are doctors, and I don't expect you to have any kind of inside scoop on that from that sense. But and again, this is your private medical information, and you don't have to answer it. But has medication played any role in the last 12 years?
No.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting.
I was put on various forms of medication whilst I was in the clinic.
Yeah.
It's not an exact science.
No.
One chemical combination for one individual doesn't work for the next. The downside to some of the drugs they exacerbated my symptoms.
Right. Interesting.
There was one drug in particular that definitely made me hallucinate and definitely made me want to take my own life even more. That's not a good thing, clearly. And I'm being glib there, but it's true. That you get it's a voyage of discovery, and for me, drugs just didn't work for me. It didn't do. But I know a number of people that are taking drugs to this day, antidepressant drugs. We're talking about rather than recreational.
Yeah.
And it does amazing things for them.
Absolutely.
So I don't have a strong view. For me, it just didn't work. I mean, whatever the chemical imbalance that was going on in my head at that particular time, the drug therapists for me in various combinations, and we tried a few, really actually made me on the main feel worse.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think it's really important to stress that this show is all about lived experience rather than me coming on and saying this is right and this is wrong. Yep. It's about people's experiences, so that it sort of almost turns into like a Bible, if you like, of different experiences and potential journeys you might go down. I think 1/3 of people, the stat is, medication won't work for, and I think it is just basically because the brain has got millions of neurons, and they really focus on 3 sort of main neurotransmitters, I believe, when it comes to depression. Obviously, serotonin, dopamine, and noradrenaline, I believe. Norepinephrine, it's sometimes called, which I find very difficult to say. So I'll go for the other one. But of course, I think there's over 100 neurotransmitters actually. So, sometimes you've got to play around with the system quite a bit before it.
Yeah, it's not. I mean, again, the medical community will be throwing things at the screen in a second, but it feels like an inexact science still. It definitely feels that they have to go through a series of combinations, and you're the guinea pig for a period of time. At a time when you probably feel most vulnerable. If they get it right first time and it's something you can stick on, fantastic.
Yeah.
Right? And I went through a whole range of them, including some of the really scary stuff.
Yeah.
But it just didn't work for me.
Yeah.
And I didn't like it.
Yeah.
I've never been, actually my wife always goes mad. I've got a headache and won't take a headache tablet. Because it's like, it'll go away. I'm not a great one for taking tablets anyway, so that's probably a bit of psychology behind that.
So you're saying probably quite loud and clearly, in your experiences, skills over pills, which is something I read the other day, which I quite like.
Quite like that. Yeah, for me, definitely.
For you.
But I think if I brought in 2 or 3 of my close pals that have really struggled, they would tell you the complete opposite. You've got to trust the people around you, trust the clinicians you're with. Trust that that they of course they want you to recover, right? You've got to go on a bit of a journey. It just so happened for me that it didn't work for me. Yeah, and I just want to stress again, we're definitely not saying that medication for depression doesn't work. Like David has shared, and I would definitely echo. I've got many friends who take medication for their depression, and it's absolutely the right thing to do. So please talk to your GP or a medical health professional if you've got any questions about that. Unfortunately, we're starting to get toward the end of our time, but I've got a couple of big things that I haven't covered yet. Yeah, go for it.
2 big words, really, from previous conversations. One is warning signs.
Yep.
So for you now, obviously living your best life, what would a warning sign be for you?
Yeah, if my behaviour gets a bit erratic, if I start to overthink things, certainly if I start to withdraw, if I start to maybe overanalyze, that all feels like I've been here before. Excuse me. They're big warning signs for me.
Yeah.
if I start, one of the things I like to look after myself, but when you stop looking after yourself, I'm not bothered to shower today. I just put a pair of slobbies on and slob around the house. That's not me. I'm a first thing in the morning, shower, spruce yourself up, get ready for the day.
Yeah.
I think if you're kind of, one of the things to watch out for, I guess, if you're working from home and you don't have your camera turned on, you can kind of sit in front of the screen and work all day long dressed in whatever you like. I think a certain amount of, if you haven't had a shower for a couple of days because you can't be asked, ask yourself why. Yeah. But I think, for me, they're kind of trigger signs. And actually, because I've got a good support network, my wife's not short in coming forward to tell me I'm being a bit of an arse. But actually, some of that is just because that's just how I'm thinking at that particular time. I am a sensitive soul, despite all this. Some things do cut deeper than they would do ordinarily. Yeah. But it goes back to, remember I mentioned earlier on in our conversation about this continuum. I've in my head, am I resetting? Am I resetting is kind of in my head. Yeah. And if after 2 or 3 days I'm not resetting, then okay, get into this. Yeah. Right. Get into this. Yeah. But the thing is that life is not, is not perfect, right? No. And you're going to have things that go well for you, things that go less well, some things that are completely out of your control, some things that are in your control. If you had your time over again, you'd do them differently. Yeah. These are all factors about how you feel about things generally. And, I work in an industry which is, as I said to you before, is sales led. So, if the numbers are good and the people around you are good, you're good. But the reverse is true. But how you cope with the bad stuff is a big indicator about how you're feeling. If you're going, well, that doesn't matter. We this is an episode. We pull through this. We'll get around this. We've got lots of other things to focus on. This is where we're at. It's good stuff. If you're going away at night and, kicking the wall at home, it's probably not so great, right? And that's personal to me. If it suddenly becomes like, I'm feeling the pressure, that's I'm taking too much on board and making it too much about my story, my journey.
And are you able to have a timeout and a reset? Would you allow yourself that, even being sort of in an MD role and with all the responsibility that comes with it?
My company's very good. We don't often speak to each other over the weekend. Yeah, we respect people's journey. We shut our office at 12:30 on a Friday. Yeah, give people an early start to the weekend. Great. The executive search world I work in doesn't really sleep, so I'd be a liar to say I wasn't, and the rest of my colleagues are the same. They're probably checking their emails through the weekend or whatever, but actually on the main, we stay clear. Yeah. I just talking to you earlier on, I came back from Sweden. I was in Sweden for 4 days. I didn't turn my phone off, but I didn't feel the need to check my email all the time. Yeah. And my colleagues are great. They'll call me if they need to, but they also we're great respecters. If people want to take some downtime, they take some downtime. Yeah. And that's one of the things that goes back to organisations about thinking about some of these things. If a boss is sending somebody an email at 6:30 on a Friday night, why are they sending it at 6:30 on a Friday night? Because they need that person to do it over the weekend. Is it critical? Could they have waited till they saw them on Monday? These are tiny things, but they're contributors about how people are feeling, about how they feel and what rest they're getting. If they're not getting a break and you're working 24/7, you can do that for short periods of time. You can't do it over a prolonged period of time.
I mean, I'm so grateful, David, you've come on today. I think half the listenership or viewership, if that's such a right word, are actually non-creatives anyway. So I think, it really does shine another lens for lots more people. And a lot of us in the creative industries anyway are juggling multiple jobs, and there'll be a lot of creatives who are watching and listening to this who actually might work in business as well and are putting on different hats. Just to kind of finish up, and I appreciate you've already touched on this, but if I just had to kind of condense it a little bit more, going back to that moment pre-rehab for you over 12 years ago, either to yourself or someone else in the same boat, if you could go back in time or speak to somebody in that moment, and I appreciate you don't work for the Samaritans or anybody else, what would be the main thing that you would say to somebody who was sort of at the end of that darkest moment?
You've just got to put yourself out there and ask for help. In whatever format that will be. Whether you walk into A&E, you call your GP, you call your best mate, you call Samaritans, you call Mind, you call various the charities that will step out and help you. And there's somebody on the other end of the phone that can actually step in. And let me tell you, it will make a difference. you might think your situation is hopeless, right? More often than not, it's not.
Yeah.
And early intervention and a conversation is a fantastic way of arresting the slide. So you got to make the call. But the big thing is your mates have got to be aware as well that actually early intervention from your friend to that person who might be suffering, because the person picking up the phone is often, sometimes that doesn't happen. They don't feel that they can do it. They don't want to do it. They don't feel they've got the access to it, whatever it be. But in that caring society, hey, pal, I haven't seen you for a couple of weeks. What's going on? I'm going to pop round for a coffee, or, is everything okay? Intervention by your friends is why mental health first aid trainers work very well in organisations, typically on the main, because they're a bit more aware. You're trained to be aware of how people are, and you'll step in and go, do you want to grab a coffee? Because people will open up with the right sort of questions. And there's a very good friend of mine, Rob Stevenson, again, a big shout out, does an awful lot of work in this space, but Rob has this thing where he'll ask somebody if they're okay and then ask them again.
Yeah.
I'm a big fan of that too. I think so. Sometimes it's really simple stuff. I said to you about outside, I'm a great believer in the KISS theorem, keep it simple, stupid.
Yeah.
And one of those things is just being able to step in and go, is everything okay, mate?
Yeah.
You don't see me normal self? That can make that could be life changing, and I don't mean that literally. I do mean that literally. Rather, it is life changing.
Yeah, and I think that often men, maybe it's a bit stereotypical, it can fall foul of that a bit more. Maybe the default. Yeah, I'm all right, mate. Yeah, I'm all right,
I can tell you, it's not stereotypical at all. You mentioned earlier on in the stats that there are more male suicides.
That's true. Yeah.
The bravado in us that we're fine, we can shrug it off.
I'm right.
We're
I'm all right, mate.
Pull yourself together. What's the matter with you? What have you got to be upset about? Is true.
And that's why having yourself on today, David, is an absolute game changer. I can't thank you enough. This really helps people to really understand that, this can affect anybody from any walk of life and any, in any type of business or work, or it can literally affect anybody, mental health. And you coming on here and sharing your experience is going to really help break down that stigma and give people a lot of tools as well, I think, for things that we've spoken about.
Thanks, Oliver. But thanks go to you, because you asked me to come and do it, right? My colleagues in the office will go, well, David likes nothing better than to talk about himself anyway. So this has just been a joy for me. But I mean, what I can tell you is that, you and other people in the industry are making a massive difference. So keep doing what you're doing. And I want everybody to get behind this and support what you're doing as well. Subscribe, like, share it to your friends or whatever, because this is life-changing stuff. So big up to you as well, my friend.
Thank you very much, David. And actually, you've just saved me a job at the end, so that's brilliant. I can just chill out now, which is fantastic. Obviously, we've covered an awful lot of ground today, and myself and David will have a chat afterwards about, in the show notes, any particular links that might be useful to kind of back up what we've been talking about. But unfortunately, we are out of time. David, I just want to thank you one last time. I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you too, Oliver. Stay well.
Thank you very much. And for those of you watching and listening, as always, I'll be back in 2 weeks' time. See you in 2 weeks. Look after yourself. Thank you.